They say isolation can preserve what's pure, but history tells us a different story. One of beauty turning to decay, of power collapsing under its own name. For some, the walls they built to protect their legacy became their own prison. For others, the blood they worshipped became poison. Across time and continents, families sealed themselves off from the world, believing they could hold perfection in place. But blood, when it's locked away, begins to rot. This is the story of those who tried to control their lineage and paid the ultimate price. Where kingdoms fell, villages decayed, and faces became echoes of their own ancestry. You're watching Forgotten Meridian, where history fades beyond the line of time. In the remote hollows of West Virginia, hidden behind rusted mailboxes and gravel roads that lead to nowhere, there's a family whose story feels more like folklore than fact, the Whitakers. When photographer Mark Lyta first visited them, he thought he'd stumbled into an Appalachian ghost story. But what he found wasn't fiction. It was human history at its most haunting. Generations of isolation had created something few could imagine. The family spoke mostly through grunts, gestures, and eyes that said more than words ever could. They lived in a world forgotten by progress, a time capsule where the outside world simply never arrived. Lyta's lens revealed what years of silence had done. Bodies shaped by genetics that never mixed. Minds dimmed by a cycle of isolation too long to trace. It was a glimpse into what happens when human connection collapses inward, when survival becomes inheritance. Yet behind the tragedy was something strangely sacred, a family holding on to existence, however fragile. The Whitakers didn't ask to be legends of genetics. They just lived, quietly, unknowingly carrying the story of what happens when bloodlines fold in on themselves. Across the mountains, another family carried a legacy that was visible not in silence, but in color. The Fugits of Troublesome Creek, the Blue People of Kentucky. It sounds like folklore, a story too strange to be real, but science says otherwise. In the early 1800s, Martin Fugate and his wife Elizabeth carried a rare gene that changed how oxygen moved through the blood. Their descendants were born with skin tinted in shades of pale indigo and violet. Blue lips, blue hands, blue hearts. An entire family marked by color. In that secluded valley, where new families rarely arrived and the same names filled every gravestone, this rare trait spread quietly through generations. People whispered, called them cursed, but the Fugates endured, farming, marrying, and living like anyone else. One woman, Luna Fugate, was described as the bluest person anyone had ever seen. Her skin like the twilight sky, her lips dark as a bruise. But she lived to be 84. And when asked if she wished her skin were different, she smiled and said, "I'm not sure. I think this is just who we are. Maybe that's the truth of all isolation. You stop seeing yourself as strange and start seeing yourself as inevitable." But isolation isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it hides something much darker. In the wilderness of New South Wales, Australia, a family known as the Colts lived a nightmare generations deep. When investigators arrived in 2012, they found dozens of children. None knew who their real fathers were. There were no schools, no running water, no connection to the outside world. Just silence, filth, and confusion passed down like inheritance. This was not the product of ignorance alone. It was the product of neglect, secrecy, and generational damage. Every child was a living reminder of how isolation can deform not only bodies, but souls. The authorities called it unprecedented. The headlines called it horrific. But behind those words was something more ancient. The same human impulse to close the world off, to keep everything in the family, until the family itself becomes a tragedy. Even among the great and powerful, the story didn't change. Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, the man who taught the world that variation was nature's survival, married his own cousin. He knew the risks, even wrote about them in his notes. But love, or perhaps tradition, prevailed. And when 3 of their 10 children died young, Darwin began to wonder if his own bloodline was testing the very theory he'd built his life upon. He studied plants and animals, tracing their traits across generations, and realized something chilling: nature punishes what refuses to change. Darwin's brilliance uncovered evolution, but his own family became a quiet example of what happens when evolution stands still. And then there were the royals, the ones whose blood was believed to be divine and whose names could command armies and rewrite borders, the Habsburgs. Their empire stretched across Europe, Austria, Spain, the Holy Roman lands. But their greatest enemy wasn't a foreign army. It was their own reflection. For centuries, they married within their family, believing their blood was chosen by God. Uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins, each generation narrowing the line further. The results were impossible to ignore. Misshapen jaws, weak limbs, frail heirs who couldn't speak clearly or stand without help. The so-called Habsburg jaw became a symbol of divine power gone grotesque. By the time King Charles II of Spain took the throne, the dynasty had collapsed into a portrait of genetic ruin. He was infertile, half-mad, and barely able to eat. The line ended with him, a royal bloodline so determined to remain pure that it purified itself out of existence. But the Habsburgs weren't alone. Across Europe, other dynasties, the Bourbons, the Ptolemies, the Windsors, all believed they could outsmart nature through control. They thought purity meant perfection. They forgot that life itself depends on difference. Queen Victoria's descendants carried a genetic curse of their own, hemophilia, a disease that turns a single cut into a death sentence. She passed it unknowingly to the royal families of Spain, Germany, and Russia. The same blood that symbolized power became the weakness that nearly ended those empires. Everywhere you look in history, you see the same pattern: isolation, tradition, fear, a belief that the world outside corrupts, and that only what's within can be trusted. But when families build walls high enough to keep the world out, they also block out evolution, progress, and light. The result is always the same: decay that begins quietly and ends tragically. Even the farthest corners of the earth aren't immune. On Pitcairn Island, a place born from rebellion, the descendants of British mutineers and Tahitian women lived in perfect isolation for over 200 years. Cut off from the world, they built their own rules, their own laws, and eventually their own horrors. In the 2000s, investigators discovered generations of abuse, acts so disturbing that the island's population was nearly erased by its own secrets. A community that began as an escape from tyranny had turned into one of history's most haunting examples of what happens when people forget that connection is survival. Every one of these stories, from royal palaces to forgotten farms, proves the same truth. When we try to control blood, we lose it. When we try to preserve perfection, we destroy it. Purity isn't protection. It's a slow, silent extinction. The Whitakers, the Fugates, the Colts, the Habsburgs, each are chapters of the same book humanity keeps writing. The one where power, fear, and pride convince us we can outsmart nature, that we can shape life to our will. But nature doesn't bargain. It always wins. And perhaps that's the most haunting truth of all. The families who locked themselves away weren't monsters. They were just people who loved too narrowly, who believed too deeply in something that was never meant to be controlled. Their stories are warnings, reminders that we're not meant to exist in isolation, that our differences are what keep us alive. Because when the line of blood becomes a circle, it stops moving forward, and when it stops, life itself begins to disappear. You've been watching Forgotten Meridian, where history fades beyond the line of time. Subscribe and continue exploring the stories that the world tried to forget, but time refused to bury.